Well, I hate to start off the sermon with a downer statement, but there are a lot of things wrong with this world. It wasn't meant to be funny, but you know what? Go ahead and laugh. Now, we don't always agree on exactly what the problem is all the time, but I think generally speaking, most people around the world recognize that this is not a perfect world. Now, though we can believe that and know that intellectually from a pretty young age, I think that there has to come a time, there comes a moment in our lives when the reality of this world's flaws become real to us. We have a moment or a season in which our naive assumptions about life are shattered, when we're confronted with the disappointment, the very real disappointment and frustration that comes with living in an imperfect world. And as human beings, we look for ways to deal with that reality. And I find that we tend to have three basic reactions. And it's not that we choose one. It's just depending on the circumstances and depending on our personalities, we might pick a different reaction at a different time under a different set of circumstances. But it's usually three basic reactions. Either we resist it, we deny it, or we accept it as it is. Now, acceptance sounds good, I know. But the thing about acceptance is it often leads to complacency. We accept that the problems in this world simply are what they are, but that attitude can prevent us from changing things that can and should be changed. Denial is the worst response. Denying the problems in this world makes us feel safe and secure, sure, but it also breeds ignorance. Not to mention, denial fails to prepare us for those times in our lives when we're confronted by this world's harsh realities. Resistance takes different forms, everything from quiet nonconformity to violent revolution. And though history has taught us Christians that total pacifism is impractical, to this day we Christians have a call to shun violence. However, we are called to quiet resistance against the evils of this world. Now, immediately when I was thinking of quiet resistance, it made me think of Martin Luther King Jr. King was a brilliant theologian and scholar, as well as a powerful preacher and an inspiring social activist. Now, I don't suppose I'd use the word quiet for Dr. King, but he did have a strict commitment to peaceful resistance. Even though he was a Christian minister, Dr. King learned about peaceful resistance from an interesting place. He learned about it from a Hindu named Mohandas Gandhi. Maybe you've heard of him. In his own writings, this is what King wrote. He wrote, the Christian doctrine of love, operating through the Gandhian method of nonviolence, was one of the most potent weapons available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. Christ furnished the spirit and motivation, while Gandhi furnished the method. Furthermore, he explains that peaceful resistance is not only about the lack of physical violence, it's also about the lack of verbal or emotional violence. He writes, the nonviolent resistor not only refuses to shoot his opponent, but he also refuses to hate him. We Christians live in a world that is hostile to what we stand for. We stand for social responsibility when the world stands for self-interest. We stand for moral integrity when the world favors personal convenience and personal satisfaction. We stand for eternity when the world is obsessed with the here and now. We stand for compassion when the world prefers anger. We stand for a balanced life under the rule of a God who stands above it all, instead of making gods out of certain aspects of life like the world does. We are a people of quiet resistance, and we've always been. But it's not easy to maintain our quiet resistance. Sometimes we become impatient with the evils of this world, and we can become too aggressive in our opposition to them. Or else we become weary of resisting, and we begin to give up or give in. That was the mistake made by the two ancient churches we're looking at today. We've been looking at 7 letters that were dictated by the resurrected Jesus to his old friend and follower, John. These letters were written to 7 churches, 7 Christian communities in what is now Turkey. Now, so far we've looked at these letters from heaven that were written to the Christians in the coastal cities of Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum. Now today we're heading inland to look at the churches of Thyatira and Sardis. Now Thyatira was a city of trade guilds. Each trade had a patron deity, and the guild participants would have monthly feasts in honor of their patron gods. Not being a member of a guild and not attending these monthly feasts would have put citizens at a disadvantage both socially and economically. So Christians faced a tough choice: either participate in what is essentially a form of pagan worship, or be excluded from the economic life of the community. And it's to this group of Christians that Jesus dictates this letter. To the angel of the church in Thyatira write, "These are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like blazing fire, and whose feet are like burnished bronze. I know your deeds, your love and faith, your service and perseverance, and that you are now doing more than you did at first. Nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet. By her teaching, she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. I have given her time to repent of her immorality, but she is unwilling. So I will cast her on a bed of suffering, and I will make those who commit adultery with her suffer intensely unless they repent of her ways. I will strike her children dead. Then all the churches will know that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each of you according to your deeds. Now I say to the rest of you in Thyatira, to you who do not hold to her teaching and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets, I will not impose any other burden on you except to hold on to what you have until I come. To the one who is victorious and does my will to the end, I will give authority over the nations. That one will rule them with an iron scepter and will dash them to pieces like pottery, just as I have received authority from my Father. I will also give that one the morning star. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches." So the Christians in Thyatira, as a community, were actually doing fairly well. Jesus commends their love, their faith, their service, their perseverance, but there was a problem. They were allowing someone, apparently a woman, to mislead people in their church. Jesus calls her Jezebel, which is another Old Testament reference. We see a lot of Old Testament references in the book of Revelation. In the Old Testament, Jezebel was a corrupt queen who led God's people to worship a Canaanite god named Baal. Similarly, this woman at the church of Thyatira, quote, misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. Apparently, this woman claimed that she was a prophet and that some deep secrets had been made known to her. Now, while sexual conduct is more literally discussed elsewhere in the Bible, in Revelation, sexual immorality symbolically represents abandoning the worship of the God and Father of Jesus in favor of the worship of false gods. The idolater is spiritually cheating on God, similar to how one might cheat on one's spouse. And it was that sort of sin into which this false prophetess was leading Christians in Thyatira. She was teaching them to abandon their quiet resistance and join in on the worship of false gods. This woman had apparently been given plenty of time and opportunity to stop spreading her false teaching, but time was running out. She would suffer for misleading God's people, as would those who followed her. Those phrases, "those who commit adultery with her," and "her children," refer not literally to partners and children, but rather to those who follow her teaching. And Jesus sums up the lesson to be learned here. He says, "I am the one who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each of you according to your deeds. Friends, nothing we do, say, or think is hidden from Jesus. He might be physically absent, but he is spiritually present in a very real and significant way. And like any good parent disciplines his child, Jesus is not afraid to discipline us when we persist in ungodly ways. But it is for our own good. It's not a little kid holding a magnifying glass over an ant. It's a parent wanting what's best for his child. What's more, Jesus is much more patient with us than we are with our own children. He gave this false prophetess a long time to turn things around, but she persisted in misleading the people. Thanks to her, they abandoned their quiet resistance to an ungodly society. Now, in nearby Sardis, however, the Christians there didn't seem to need anybody to lead them astray. You see, of all the Christians of the time, the Christians in the city of Sardis actually had it pretty easy. You see, though the worship of Greco-Roman gods was certainly present in Sardis, there was a large, powerful, wealthy, and well-respected Jewish community there. And so the Christians in Sardis probably were members of that Jewish community who happened to come to believe in Jesus. And even after they became Christians, they still enjoyed the comfort, prosperity, and acceptance that they had always enjoyed before. Their faith, their conversion to Christianity didn't cost them anything. The church in Sardis was not a persecuted church. It was a comfortable church. And here's what Jesus had to say to this comfortable church. To the angel of the church in Sardis, write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know your deeds. You have a reputation of being alive, but you are dead. Wake up. Strengthen what remains and is about to die, for I have found your deeds unfinished in the sight of my God. Remember, therefore, what you have received and heard. Hold it fast and repent. But if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what time I will come to you. Yet you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their clothes. They will walk with me dressed in white, for they are worthy. The one who is victorious will, like them, be dressed in white. I will never blot out the name of that person from the book of life, but will acknowledge that name before my Father and his angels. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The Christians in Sardis were alive. They weren't being persecuted, but spiritually speaking, they were dead. They were sleeping on the job. They were, quote, leaving deeds unfinished in the sight of God. They still had a little life in them, but they needed to feed that fire before it went out. I almost feel as though this letter could have been written to modern American Christians. We are the least persecuted and most liberated Christians in the world, but we have allowed our safety and security to lull us into apathy and complacency. By and large, American Christianity is at best part of our weekly routine, and at worst, something we put on our mantle at home collecting dust until we pull it out every Easter or Christmas. Yes, Christianity used to be a bigger part of American culture, but back then it was part of the establishment. Our Christianity got comfortable and lazy because we were in charge, and now that our society has changed and we're not in charge anymore, we're struggling to figure out what living our faith is supposed to look like. We didn't have much to resist when we were in charge, but now that we share a society with people who live differently, both secular people and people of other religions, we have more to resist. And I don't mean, to make this clear, I don't mean opposing them in the public square. I hope I've already made it clear that I believe the public square is about trying to find a way to coexist peacefully with people who believe differently. But when it comes to our personal spiritual lives, We cannot let ungodly anti-Christian attitudes seep into our souls. We cannot let our clothes become soiled with society's corruption. We cannot let the selfishness, greed, hatred, impatience, short-sightedness, and ignorance of this world drown out the love, generosity, compassion, peacefulness, and wisdom that God gives. The church in Thyatira allowed a false prophetess to lure their people away into false religious practices. And those who followed her stopped their quiet resistance against idolatry. And the church in Sardis didn't have much to resist at all. And so they let their guards down. They became passive, apathetic, and frankly, useless. Friends, we still face an enemy. It isn't the government, it isn't the secularists, and it certainly isn't people who adhere to other religions. It is, in the words of Paul, like this: our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Let me repeat that just to make that clear. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Our enemy is a spiritual one, not one of flesh and blood. We have to be on our guard because we have an enemy who, if he can't destroy us, is content to lull us into uselessness and ineffectiveness. We cannot let him succeed. Let us instead continue our quiet spiritual resistance against the evil influences of a fallen world.